their wish list. Now we get beyond the wish list and we get into what is real. Let me just say, before we get into the details of this, that the budget process is done very differently than it was 10 years ago, and very, very differently than when I was in the legislature, which was eons ago. It used to be that you had an appropriations committee, you still do, and that most of the budget work was done within the appropriations committee in the light of day, and that committee hearings were meaningful, and that the agencies would get up and say what they would like, and that the public would come in and say, no, you shouldn't spend it there, you should spend it here, you should give them more, that the governor's office would actually come to hearings and do the same, and the chairman of the appropriations committee were very powerful back then. And they were broken into subcommittees, and they would take certain agencies, and the subcommittee chairs were very powerful. It was really a very collegial type process, both parties involved, and the media covered everything. Doesn't work that way now. For the last 6 years, with a Republican governor and a Republican-controlled legislature, the governor's budget comes out, as it did last Friday, and that is the base that they work off of. And they have a few ceremonial hearings, but in reality, it's Republican leadership, maybe the two approps chairmen joining them in private meetings in the governor's office with the doors closed that try to hash out the differences. And if they can hash them out, as they have in 4 of the last 5 years, remember last year, Medicaid expansion didn't work, so the governor then reached out to the Dems and there was the bipartisan coalition. But normally I project that this year, as well as 4 of the last 5 years, they'll hash it out behind closed doors, and then voila, late in the session, a budget will come out that they've reached, and the Republicans will pass it, and they'll go home. And so the governor's budget recommendation is critical now, because that is the base. I hate to put it this way, but in most cases, from entities that want money invested in services, whether it be education or social services, usually the best deal you're going to get is the governor's budget. And so while a lot of people are really disappointed, they rally around the governor's budget and hope that the conservative Republican leadership does not go into those meetings and get her to come down and get her to reduce some of the spending that the advocates are lobbying for. That's the way the world works right now at the state capitol. So, let's get into some details that you may not get elsewhere, but it's inside that governor's budget book, which is very thin. It's online though. If you go to the governor's budget office, it's there. Let me make a few general comments. Governor Brewer's budget, as I said, is very conservative. It's basically a hold-the-line budget, except for 3 categories, major categories. Child Protective Services. She does have a new proposal to pay K-12 schools for academic performance of their students. So she put some new money in there, as well as the inflation I talked about, the inflation money. And she's really dedicated to improving the data systems throughout state government because they're crumbling before our eyes. Also, this is not a major category, but TGen, the bioscience, did very well. They got $15 million from the governor over the next 5 years. We'll get into that in a minute. Most noteworthy is what is not in the governor's budget. There's not much in the way of restoring funding for K-12 education and the universities. The universities, by the way, I'm going to sound like an ex-regent here, so excuse me, but the universities are short more than $1 billion, with a B, from what they were receiving in 2008 before the recession. That's about 30% reduction in what the 3 public universities get from the state general fund. And people wonder why the tuition has gone up so dramatically. That's the only way, frankly, they could go and make up the difference. They haven't made up the difference, but they've made up part of it through raising the tuition quite dramatically over the last several years. With regards to K-12, the state remains basically out of the business of paying for large capital expenses for K-12 school construction and repair. The onus for that continues to fall on the local school districts themselves. This is amazing because The state Supreme Court ruled in the 1990s that they couldn't do that. You couldn't put the capital responsibilities at the local school level, that because the poor districts could not afford it, and K through 12 education was not equal from a physical capital standpoint. That money had to come out of a program from the general fund. When the recession hit, they stopped funding it. So the laws are still on the books, but they haven't been funded in years, and they're not being funded in the proposed fiscal year 2015 budget as well. There's no pay raises for state workers. Transportation spending doesn't get a meaningful boost. What you need to understand is that according to the Brewers Budget Office projections, even with her spend increases, the state budget would be structurally balanced this coming fiscal year and the next year. The one change they've made, which I think is appropriate, is not only do you have to put out a budget for the coming fiscal year in detail, but you have to make projections for the next 2 years on how much the base will need in new revenue funds and how much revenue you project will come in from the economy. That's the conservatives' desire to make the chief executive look a couple of years in advance, which I think is healthy. But it's that look into the future is where they disagree the most. The governor's budget gurus are projecting that state revenues will increase about 5% a year over the next 4 budget years. Whereas the legislative budget gurus are saying, it's only going to increase about 4%. Now that doesn't sound like much of a difference, 4 or 5% projection, but when you pencil that out into dollars, by the year 2017, there's the JLBC says that the governor's budget will be short. At that point, there'll be a structural deficit of like $700-800 million. And the governor's office is saying, no, that's not going to happen. We believe our forecasts of revenues are correct, and we will have a balanced budget. So that's the big disagreement, and they're going to have to rectify their projections on revenue before they can really draw a bottom line and say that they have a balanced budget and so forth. Most of that will go on behind closed doors. For the next year, however, the state has ample reserves, and the governor actually proposes to leave about $750 million in the bank for the future. So it shouldn't be very difficult to bridge that gap for the next year. It's what they forecast for the next few years. Okay, Child Protective Services. I'm going to go through these quickly, but this is where the action is. The governor, by executive order on January 13th, created the temporary Division of Child Safety and Family Services, which reports directly to her. It's CPS under a new name, and she has asked the legislature to help her create a permanent, separate Child Safety and Family Services agency, a new CPS with a new title, standing free of the rest of DES with its own director. She proposes not only an increase in funding for that new entity in the coming year, but she wants a supplemental budget increase right now because of the crisis. She's asking for $15.3 million in supplemental funding for the current year to increase the number of caseworkers and to address funding needs within the program. The fiscal year 15 budget, which starts July 1, requests $80.2 million above the current year's general fund to help pay for those additional employees and more. So when you get to caseworkers, supervisors, and support staff, the governor is recommending $5.7 million in supplemental funding in the current year. She wants to start hiring these new people next month. To hire 212 caseworkers, 120 supervisors, and support staff beginning in February of this year. The fiscal year 15 recommendation in this area includes $21.5 million for full year funding of the new staff. In addition, she wants $500,000 for 6 new attorneys to provide legal representation to CPS as well. In the Office of Child Welfare Investigations, the governor's budget recommends $8.6 million for 68 investigators and 25 supervisors and support staff, allowing the office to increase its investigation rate to 100% for the two major populated counties, Maricopa and Pima. In the emergency and residential placement division, the governor's asking for $18 million in supplemental funds for this year to meet the increased demand for shelters and group homes when family foster homes are not available. In children's support services, the governor's asking for $5.4 million in supplemental funds for this year to keep up with the increased number of children in the CPS system, with $5.6 million being continued into the next full fiscal year 15. For foster care, no additional funding for children in family foster homes. For adoption, she asked for $6 million in new money to keep up with the caseload for adoptive family qualifying services. The child's system is their computer system. Not surprising, it is a disaster, right? Like the rest of the state government. And she wants $10 million to go to the Department of Administration to replace that automated system for CPS. And finally, the creation of the new agency itself. Nobody's quite sure how much that's going to cost, frankly. And so she's asked for the legislature to put aside $25 million into the Department of Administration so that they have money available for technology and capital. They don't even know if they're going to need to rent a new building or whether they're still going to be housed in DES facilities. So as those decisions are made, they want to have a pot of money to help fund that. Other DES funding. This is critical. CPS, I hate to put it this way, but DES does a lot of other things, as you know, from job training to adult services to, you can just go on with many different child care, subsidies and so forth. But CPS and the horror of CPS in the recent years has really gotten the publicity and has been a drag, frankly, on the rest of DES, a lot of people believe. And so now you have DES, the rest of the services are eventually going to be by themselves. The governor asked for other DES funding. In child care, unfortunately, she doesn't ask for a penny of new funding. That continues the enrollment freeze for low-income working families that has turned away an estimated 33,000 children since the freeze was put into place in February of 2009 due to the recession. It's one of the first things that was cut. You have a lot of single parents, let's face it, mainly single moms, that want to go to work, but they can't afford childcare. And they desperately need a subsidy from the state to make that happen. And no additional funding in childcare is in the governor's budget. DES funding backfill. Their $33.7 million of general fund money is put in to replace one-time funding sources, mostly federal, that have been depleted. We have less federal money coming into the state in some of these areas, and so to keep the programs going, the general fund, state general fund has to backfill it. The Arizona Early Intervention Program increases funding for the program by $1.5 million, which supports and services for infants and toddlers with developmental delays or disabilities. In the benefits and medical eligibility area, the governor's budget recommends $4.6 million to fund workers to increase the accuracy in eligibility determination and to combat fraud in the food stamp program, or SNAP program now as it's called, and the TANF cash assistance program. Adult Protective Services, the governor did stick with the wish list. She put $5.2 million. It adds 40 investigators and 24 support staff for Adult Protective Services because of a huge increase in complaints. Healthcare, very quickly, as you can imagine, Medicaid caseload and inflation. The governor does, for the first time in a long while, doesn't have to put new money into it because of the federal matching funds coming in from Obamacare. It actually saves the state general fund for access and behavioral health services, both of those areas. $18.4 million is saved that they used elsewhere in the state budget. Bad news on kids care. It continues the freeze on the original kids care program and fails to provide funding for 37,000 children currently covered through Kids Care 2, which ends on January 31st of this year. We are the only state in the country that is phasing out our kids care programs. What else is in the budget? Prisons. They didn't get their $60 million that they wished for, but they are getting $22.4 million. Actually, they're getting a total of $30 million. They're getting half a loaf. The governor wants $22.4 million to annualize 500 new private prison beds and 500 new state-operated beds that they'd already planned to activate this current fiscal year. And the activation of a second 500 private prison facility that will, 500-bed facility that will activate in the next coming fiscal year. And that prison management computer system, $8 million going to the Department of Administration for the cost of replacing the Arizona inmate management system. K through 12. The biggest chunk of new spending is in K through 12, where Governor Brewer wants to add an additional $86.6 million to implement new performance-based funding, bolster the state's charter schools, and make other changes. K through 12 schools would receive another $70 million, as I mentioned earlier, for inflation because of the court ruling. And Governor Brewer also wants to levy a $15 student fee, per student fee, $15 a head, on school districts and charter schools to put broadband technology in every school in the state. A little surcharge. This is not going over well in the legislature, so I don't know whether she can get that. About $40 million will go to K through 12 performance funding plan that the governor has dubbed Student Success Funding. Unlike the plan Brewer proposed last year, which based performance funding on districts and charter schools' letter grades that you often see on the side of the school. This is a B+ school or whatever. The new plan will allocate funding based on individual student performance. Students can earn their school's money by scoring at or above grade level, show above average improvement in better than 50% of their peers, or by simply graduating and improving their graduation rate, particularly for the high schools. So this was some more performance funding. Mixed bag. I've heard K through 12 people, it's better than what she was proposing last year, let's put it that way, because it used to be you had to be at a certain level to get any of this new money. Now, if you're at a low level, you can at least get some of the money by showing improvement, going from D to C, or C to B, which some people feel is a lot fairer, because in certain, unfortunately, in low-income areas, the grades and the scores tend to be lower, and so they were being, in a sense, penalized. Higher education. Higher education, Brewers proposed giving them $27.4 million to retire the parity funding program early, which was implemented to ensure that ASU and NAU receive the same amount of per student funding as the U of A, which the U of A has had the highest per student cost of the three forever. And so this really gives more money to ASU and NAU to get all three universities in a same per student level. That was supposed to be phased in. The governor's given them a slug of money to get it done all at once. While she isn't proposing any new dollars for performance funding, she is proposing to put a clear and simple performance-based funding formula in statute for the universities to use in future years, but conspicuously absent from Brewer's proposal for higher education was that $1 billion request by the Board of Regents for research labs. And the governor's budget office just simply said, he had to address it some way, and when asked, he said, quote, "We're asking for a little more patience from our K through 12 communities and our universities." They just don't have the money to do that, and the governor did not make that a priority. And it's hard to believe that universities has some champions in the legislature, but probably not enough to make much of an increase over what the governor is recommending. The rainy day fund, we have a required rainy day fund. Every penny was used during the recession. It's up to $450 million. That's sitting there so that if there's another economic crisis, another recession, we've got something to fall back on. Governor wants to put $50 million into the rainy day fund and bring it up to $508.4 million. That could be a flexible $50 that I could see being negotiated and used elsewhere during the negotiations. And finally, she wants a tax cut. Not finally, but she wants a tax cut. She wants to exempt electricity used by manufacturers from the state sales tax to encourage more manufacturing. That's going to cost somewhere between 25 and 30 million. Very quickly, transportation. The governor, for years now, they've been removing the highway user revenue fund, which is supposed to go for roads and go part of it to the cities for streets. They've been sweeping that fund like most other funds. It's paying, I think, for DPS right now, the Department of Public Safety. Legislature would like to start getting that money back into roads where it belongs, but the governor didn't do it in her budget because it's just a money thing. It's like a couple $100 million. And if she did that, then she wouldn't have money for some of the other things that I've been telling you about. That will probably be part of the behind closed doors negotiations. I could see her maybe, okay, we'll give you 50, 60 million to go back into roads, and maybe I won't put that 50 million in the rainy day fund this year. That kind of thing to try to keep it balanced. One-time funding, in one-time capital expenditures that include plumbing and infrastructure and fire alarms across the state. The governor is putting $54 million into one-time funding. Also one-time funding, $5 million into a military installation fund, which will be used, frankly, to fight the federal government in trying to convince them not to close military bases here in Arizona that are huge economic entities, Davis, Monthan, Luke, etc. Because the BRAC process at the federal level is constantly going on, and we're competing against other states and other military institutions. And then finally, the $15 million for TGen, which is going to flow through the University of Arizona, but it goes right in, $3 million a year for 5 years, pretty much for whatever TGen needs to use it for. They think that the governor believes that is a very successful bioscience initiative that is helping Arizona's economy tremendously, as well as trying to find cures for diseases, etc. And so that was one of the few areas that was sort of outside the box that she put new money into. And it'll be interesting to see whether she can hold on to that. My guess is she will, but that dollar amount may come down some.